The story of Sonic Youth begins in 1976, when 18-year-old Thurston Moore dropped out after just one semester at university. Determined to dive headfirst into music, he moved to New York, a city that, in the late 70s, was turning into the beating heart of post-punk, no wave, and all things underground. Moore, influenced by bands like the Sex Pistols, Blondie, and Talking Heads, formed his first group, Roomtone, with some roommates. They soon renamed themselves Coachmen. From 1978 on, the band became a regular in New York's club scene, giving Moore valuable experience writing songs and performing live. But even though Coachmen had its charm, it lacked originality. Moore knew it. He was still looking for a voice, a style that could set him apart from the rest. That all changed in 1980. At what would be Coachman's final gig, Moore met Kim Gordon, and the encounter would shape the rest of his life. On the surface, Gordon seemed like his opposite, calm, educated, methodical, and deeply rooted in the world of visual art. Her love of new wave music came not from raw rebellion, but from a philosophical fascination with its freedom and its challenge to traditional rock. And that's exactly what Moore needed. Someone who could broaden his perspective and ground his intensity. Their connection quickly turned romantic. He taught her guitar. She introduced him to avant-garde art theory. They decided to start a band together, aiming to fuse music and noise, rebellion and structure. The name they chose said it all, Sonic Youth. In June 1981, they played at the Noise Fest at White Columns, a New York gallery, where they met guitarist Lee Ranaldo. He immediately clicked with the duo, and within days, they performed together as Sonic Youth. With no drummer at first, all three had to awkwardly rotate behind the kit until Richard Edson joined as a permanent member. Now complete, the group wasted no time. Backed by avant-garde composer Glenn Branca's Neutral label, Sonic Youth recorded their self-titled debut EP in March 1982. Stylistically, it was a far cry from what the band would later become. You could feel the urgency, the desire to make a mark. Moore and Ronaldo were still finding their footing as collaborators, so the songs leaned heavily on standard tuning and tight post-production. The result, critics said, was like a darker, moodier cousin of new wave, more curious than groundbreaking. Commercially, it went nowhere. Soon after the release, Edson left the band to pursue acting. He was replaced by Bob Burt, though Moore often criticized his drumming, creating tension. As the band geared up for a second album, they knew another flop could bury them for good. So Burt was replaced by Jim Sklavounos, whose powerful drumming helped define Confusion is Sex, the band's first full-length LP, released in 1983. That album was a complete departure from anything they'd done before. It wasn't just experimental, it was confrontational. Raw, dissonant, and unsettling, Confusion is Sex sounded like a subway panic attack turned into an art piece. Nothing about it felt like a conventional song. There were fragments of rage and alienation, tangled in feedback, weird tunings, and almost robotic vocals. Every member contributed. This was no frontman act, but a collective eruption. The result felt more like a statement than a record. It repels you at first, but like a scratch on a vinyl that keeps looping, it stays in your mind. Critics today often call it one of Sonic Youth's most underrated works, especially in the US. Ironically, the band's chaotic sound found a warmer reception in Europe, where they began to make real money, not from album sales, but from relentless touring. But the drummer seat continued to be a revolving door. Sklavounos left, and Bob Burt was brought back once again. His drumming featured on the Kill Year Idols EP, released in October 1983. This record felt more like an epilogue to Confusion is Sex than a fresh chapter, featuring mostly leftover material rather than a bold new direction. In 1984, Thurston Moore and Kim Gordon got married, but they didn't celebrate in a chapel or on a beach. They spent their wedding day in a recording studio, laser-focused on finishing their next album. That album, Bad Moon Rising, was released in March 1985, and with it, Sonic Youth began to move beyond pure noise. The chaos was still there, but now it served a purpose. The band started shaping sound into something more structured and atmospheric, using dissonance and unconventional song forms, not just to shock, but to haunt. Bad Moon Rising drips with paranoia, apathy, and a slow-burning sense of dread. It's a sonic reflection of the cultural anxiety gripping mid-80s America, a landscape still shadowed by the Kennedy assassination, suburban malaise, and the hollowing out of pop culture. Tracks like Death Valley 69, featuring the feral vocals of Lydia Lunch, turn real-life horror into a ritualistic howl. Others, like Ghost Bitch and I Love Her All the Time, sound like incantations delivered over a backdrop of industrial decay. This wasn't just music, it was a transmission from the underbelly of American consciousness. A protest, yes, but also a kind of psychological report. While the New York press largely ignored Bad Moon Rising, dismissing Sonic Youth as too artsy and too aloof, the UK press paid attention. The album sold 5,000 copies there and drew serious critical praise. But behind the scenes, things were far from smooth. A dispute over royalty payments broke out between the band and their label, Neutral Records. The growing buzz around Sonic Youth wasn't translating into financial stability. Both the band and the label were suffering. Eventually, Sonic Youth broke ties with Neutral and signed to SST Records, an indie powerhouse with deeper resources and a more artist-friendly reputation. For the band, this was a leap forward. They finally had the tools to go bigger. Another major shift came at the end of 1985, when drummer Bob Burt left the band for good. He was replaced by Steve Shelley, and it turned out to be the missing piece Sonic Youth had been waiting for. Shelley brought rhythm, restraint, and a newfound discipline to their sound. His drumming tethered the band's wild experiments to something more grounded, just enough structure to let the chaos breathe without falling apart. With a new drummer and a new label, Sonic Youth quickly got to work. In May 1986, they released Evol, an album that marked a turning point. This was the sound of the band maturing. The dissonance was still there, but now it was creeping, deliberate, hypnotic. The title, Evol, love spelled backwards, was more than a pun. It hinted at a deeper inversion, a twisted reflection of intimacy and decay. The music no longer assaulted the listener. It crawled under the skin. The band began playing with space, silence, and melody. On Tom Violence and Shadow of a Doubt, Kim Gordon's voice emerges like a whisper from a fever dream. Calm, eerie, and completely unforgettable. Evol is a meditation on love as destruction, on American innocence curdled into something darker. It's cinematic, fractured, and layered with tension. It was clear now, Sonic Youth weren't just an experimental noise outfit. They were architects of a new kind of rock music, disruptive, intelligent, and totally outside the mainstream. Evol finally earned them widespread critical acclaim and is now considered a cornerstone of the American underground. This was the moment Sonic Youth became more than just a cult band. They became a movement. By 1987, Sonic Youth was building real momentum. Fueled by a wave of inspiration, they released Sister, a loose concept album partially inspired by the life and work of science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. The sister in the title refers to Dick's twin, who died shortly after birth, an event that haunted him for the rest of his life. That sense of loss, disorientation, and fractured identity echoes throughout the record. Sister marked another step away from their noisy, no-wave origins toward a more refined alternative rock structure, though they never abandoned their experimental core. The album blended raw guitars with literary references, dissonance with melody. It sold around 60,000 copies and earned glowing reviews. For the first time, a Sonic Youth album cracked the top 20 in the Village Voices Pass and Job Critics poll. But even then, the band knew this wasn't the peak they were chasing. Commercially, they were still stuck in the underground. Their songs were becoming cult classics, but not radio hits. Frustrated with their current label, they made a risky move to the smaller Enigma Records. On paper, it looked like a step backwards, but in 1988, it paid off. That year, they released Daydream Nation, a towering achievement not just for Sonic Youth, but for alternative music as a whole. This wasn't just a record, it was a declaration. Daydream Nation is a sprawling soundscape of urban melancholy, youthful rebellion, and intellectual defiance. It weaves together feedback, surrealist lyrics, punk urgency, and post-rock ambition with near-symphonic scope, especially in the epic 14-minute suite trilogy. The opener, Teenage Riot, sets the tone as a generational anthem, a call to dreamers where political utopia merges with personal escape. The guitars don't just play, they argue, drift, shimmer, explode. Each riff feels like a character in its own right. This wasn't noise for the sake of noise. It was architecture, chaotic, raw, but deeply intentional. Thurston Moore was the driving force behind this shift. It was his idea to make Daydream Nation a double album, designed with a narrative arc, inspired by everything from classic 60s rock to the improvisational chaos of free jazz. His lyrics hovered between poetic abstraction and sharp political undercurrents, making every track feel like a layered manifesto. Moore also spearheaded the album's guitar work, experimenting wildly with tunings, feedback, and effects, sculpting a sonic world that was both dense and immersive. Without his vision and intuitive sense of controlled chaos, Daydream Nation wouldn't have become what it did, the soundtrack of a cultural awakening. The album's lead single, Teenage Riot, was also a breakthrough. It became Sonic Youth's first track to gain significant radio airplay, especially on college and alternative rock stations. It even hit number 20 on the Billboard Modern Rock Tracks chart. Suddenly, the underground was being pulled into the spotlight. That success caught the attention of major labels. Sonic Youth signed with Geffen Records, a move that raised eyebrows, but also expectations. Could they keep their edge under a corporate roof? In 1990, the band answered with Goo, and the answer was yes. The album was both a critical and commercial success. But more importantly, Sonic Youth proved that they could enter the mainstream without softening their message. If anything, they sharpened it. The lead single, Cool Thing, featuring Public Enemy's Chuck D, was a bold feminist punk anthem wrapped in a scathing satire of pop culture. Dirty Boots told a chaotic love story set against walls of noise. Tunic, Song for Karen, took the tragic story of Karen Carpenter and turned it into a gothic parable about fame, repression, and identity. Goo was Sonic Youth's sly invasion of the mass market, not a sellout, but a subversive act. They didn't just speak to a wider audience, they infected it with their strange, noisy, and intelligent virus. Sonic Youth solidified their place in the alt-rock pantheon in 1992 with the release of Dirty. The album reached number 83 on the US Billboard 200 and climbed to number 6 on the UK Albums chart. It spawned 4 singles. 100% led the pack and performed reasonably well, though it fell short of becoming the crossover hit many expected. Youth Against Fascism followed, but failed to chart. Sugarcane gained moderate traction, while Drunken Butterfly remained more of a cult favorite than a commercial success. In the wake of Dirty, critics and fans alike assumed Sonic Youth would follow Nirvana and Pearl Jam into full-fledged grunge stardom, but that would have been too easy, and frankly, too predictable. Instead, they went the opposite way. Rather than embracing the mainstream, they used their newfound fame as a kind of artistic shield, doubling down on unpredictability, rawness, and experimentation. So in 1994, they released Experimental Jet Set, Trash, and No Star, an album that felt like a quiet rebellion against the MTV era itself. There were no hits, no anthems, no glossy production. Just fragmented, lo-fi, emotionally raw tracks. Kim Gordon whispered more than she sang. Moore sounded exhausted, almost mournful. The guitars were deliberately unpolished, like sketches instead of paintings. The result was a record that confused casual listeners, but fascinated longtime fans. It sold well, but it felt less like a statement and more like a turning point. Sonic Youth were peeling away the last layers of conventional rock. Then came Washing Machine in 1995, and with it, a sense of breath, of space. The aggression softened, but the edge remained. The album was longer, dreamier, more meditative. Its centerpiece, The Diamond Sea, clocked in at 19 minutes and unfolded like a slow-motion meltdown. An abstract guitar odyssey about love, decay, and time. Think Pink Floyd, but filtered through New York noise. It wasn't a song, it was a soundscape, a shimmering wave of feedback, loops, and feeling. Sonic Youth had stopped smashing through walls. Now they were dissolving them. In the aftermath of Kurt Cobain's death and the decline of grunge, Sonic Youth became something else. Mentors, icons, living legends. They launched their own label, SYR, where they released instrumental and avant-garde projects far too strange for mainstream consumption. They weren't chasing trends anymore, they were building their own rules. improvisation, noise experiments, collaborations with experimental artists. If the music industry was crumbling, Sonic Youth decided to reinvent it from scratch. In 1998, they released 1,000 Leaves, a record that felt like the crystallization of their mature phase. It was dreamy, impressionistic, poetic. Sunday flirted with pop, but even that track carried the weariness of artists burned out by the endless album tour grind. This wasn't rebellion anymore, it was reflection. A slow drift through the emotional aftershocks of decades in the underground. From 2000 to 2013, Sonic Youth entered their final act, focused, wise, and still quietly revolutionary. The new millennium opened with NYC Ghosts and Flowers, 2000, and Murray Street, 2002, where spoken word poetry merged with rich guitar textures and elegant dissonance. These albums marked a return to structure, but not convention. They kept the spirit of the avant-garde alive while exploring beauty in restraint. Sonic Nurse, 2004, and Rather Ripped, 2006, were their most accessible albums. Cleaner, calmer, more melodic, but still full of that signature Sonic Youth tension. Thoughtful, intelligent, uneasy. Their final studio album, The Eternal, 2009, came out on indie label Matador. It was a fitting send-off, loud, sharp, catchy, but never desperate. At the same time, each band member was exploring side projects and solo work. The band wasn't fading, it was fracturing. Everything came to a halt in 2011 when Kim Gordon and Thurston Moore announced their separation. It wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of an era. For a band so deeply rooted in the chemistry between those two minds, Sonic Youth couldn't survive without them. In 2013, the band was officially done. No farewell tour, no greatest hits package, just silence.